My name is Abby. I am one of the 30 by 30 program managers at the Ocean Protection Council, and I'm joined today by my two colleagues, sort of the bulk of the team that's been working on 30 by 30, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Abby. Nice to meet you, Eric. Nice to meet you, Jamie. Mike Escrow. I'm a senior scientist, senior program manager here at OPC. I lead our biodiversity team, so that includes all our work on 30 by 30 and marine protected areas, habitat protection and restoration, sustainable fisheries, aquaculture. I'm our agency's tribal liaison as well. So yeah, lead up a small but mighty team here at OPC, which includes Abby and Ann, my colleagues, who work really closely with me on 30 by 30, and I'll kick it over to Ann.
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you, Eric and Jamie. My name's Ann Deep. I'm the other 30 by 30 program manager, and I help a lot on our community engagement and tribal affairs as it relates to 30 by 30.
Since this is a smaller group, I'm going to start presenting. But if during this presentation you have any questions or anything, you can feel free to raise your hand or something, and I will do my best to answer that. And if I miss that cue, Ann, just make sure you flag me. So I stopped talking. But so Mike, Ann, and I are the core 30 by 30 team, but we are led at Ocean Protection Council by Jen Eckerly, our executive director. And this summer we have the pleasure of Mina Adabag working with us as our summer intern. We also work really closely with the Ocean Science Trust and Dr. Liz Whiteman, the executive director, and Dr. Heidi Waite, the science officer. And at one of our regional workshops this summer, we were joined by their summer intern, Leah Escobar. So 30 by 30 started in October 2020 as an executive order from Governor Newsom in 8220, which committed California to conserving 30% of its lands and coastal waters by 2030, hence the 30 by 30 target. This really put California at the leading edge of this movement that is international to protect nature and biodiversity. It was then adopted domestically as the America the Beautiful under the Biden-Harris administration initiative, and then internationally in 2022 in Montreal, it was signed at the Convention on Biodiversity by over 200 nations. So this target goal has three important priorities: protect biodiversity, expand access, and improve climate resilience and mitigation. So in 2022, the California Natural Resources Agency released Pathways to 30 by 30, which really outlines all the strategies and opportunities for how we're going to get to meet this target. And one thing that the Pathways document, and as we're talking, Anne will put links into the chat for all these sort of references that I'm mentioning, including this Pathways document. The Pathways document gave us our definition of like what is a 30 by 30 conservation area, and it is a land and coastal water area that is durably protected and managed to sustain functional ecosystems, both intact and restored, and the diversity of life that they support. So right now, 16.2% of our coastal waters are conserved by the State Marine Protected Area Network. Because this network meets that definition of conservation for 30 by 30. So how are we going to get to the other 14%? And in Pathways, we laid out four approaches to 30 by 30. The first is adaptively managing the state's marine protected area network. The second is strengthening biodiversity protections in California's federally marine managed national marine sanctuaries. The third is supporting tribally led conservation through the creation of indigenous marine stewardship areas. And the fourth is exploring the role of other marine managed areas in conserving biodiversity. So this would be looking at water quality protection areas. Eric.
Yeah, quick question for you. On the 16%, how do you guys calculate the percentages that are conserved? Is that just state waters? And I mean, obviously, water is
Yeah.
three-dimensional. So yeah, curious how that's calculated.
Great question. So it's state waters, so it goes from the coastline out to 3 nautical miles. Interestingly enough, to be consistent with a lot of other planning and mapping, the waters of San Francisco Bay are included within the land site of 30 by 30, just because of the way that the coastal waters have been used for a long time. So it's that like band of coastal waters from the coastline out to 3 nautical miles. So that's our denominator. And then the 16% is our state marine protected area network. So there's 124 marine protected areas all along the coast. These are the state marine reserves, state marine conservation areas, special closures, and a few other things. And so this network of 124 areas is what makes up that 16% of coastal waters. So everything I'm talking about today is to get to that 30% of coastal waters target goal. So that's 30%, and the denominator is our coastal water boundary.
Gotcha. And yeah, just to confirm that the MPAs, that includes all 3 levels of the protected areas. Because there's like the full closure areas, like the
state marine reserves, yeah, and then there's others that are like state marine conservation areas.
Exactly.
And they have like a spectrum of specific regulations associated with each of them. But when you look at the state MPA network as a network, it qualifies for 30 by 30. So that's how we already get to 16%, is using that 124 areas.
Okay, so all 3 classifications are counted in that. That's how it's carries. Okay, cool. Thank you. It's really helpful.
Yeah. So now we're trying to answer the question, how do we get to that other 14%, and how do we evaluate area-based management and the biodiversity conservation and protections that it provides, which is a pretty challenging question. So in order to help us with this, we pulled together, in partnership with the Ocean Science Trust, a technical advisory panel. This panel has a lot of academics that have been working on fishing, fisheries management, marine spatial planning, human dimensions, ecology, all over the state of California and also internationally. So we have a really great group of people that have pulled together and spent most of last winter and this spring and early summer working really hard on building this sort of draft framework. And so, you know, it isn't just California, it isn't just 30 by 30 that has been trying to answer like how effective are conservation outcomes and area-based management tools. So the international scientific community has really been grappling with this challenge for a while and has developed some pretty robust tools. And so we're pulling from those tools in order to help us through this evaluation process, including the MPA guide, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN tool for evaluating other effective area-based conservation measures, or OECMs. And even though I've said the name of that report about 200 times at this point, it still doesn't roll off the tongue. And some research that has been done specifically here to California, including the Decadal Management Review of our Marine Protected Area Network, and some reports from this Ocean Protection Council Science Advisory Team on climate resilience and adaptation strategies in our marine protected areas. So when we start to evaluate areas, the first thing that we evaluate, and that's really fundamental to 30 by 30, is looking at durability. So this is kind of the first part of the framework. And this is actually pretty easy to evaluate and sometimes can be hard to achieve, as I'm sure Jamie can attest to in trying to work on creating a new water quality protection area. And this just means that something, the definition of durability and pathways means that it's anything that has gone through a formal process and is not easily undone. So it's areas with species and habitat protection that have sort of gone through that formal or enforceable process. Okay, so now that everything has to start with being durable. Once we know that an area is durable, then we start to look at the biodiversity values, the conservation efforts and effects that it provides. And so for this, we've actually broken the strategy up into 2 ways. The first is looking at areas created primarily for biodiversity. And so for this, we'll be using the MPA guide. This is science-based policy relevant framework, first published in the journal Science in 2021. And this framework really looks at, you know, the enabling conditions and the stage of establishment of a protected area, but it really looks at the level of protection. And that level of protection is based on a spectrum of activities, whether it's dredging, dumping, anchoring, aquaculture, fishing, infrastructure. The variety variety of activities and things that could exist within a protected area space. And on that spectrum, how big of an impact what scale and impact do those activities have? And then based on that, you can get 5 outcomes when you're looking at that level of protection using the MPA guide. And the first 2 outcomes are incompatible or minimally protected. And those just sort of mean that either there's some activity that exists there that is at such a large impact or scale that's really incompatible with the conservation of nature, or that there's some conservation efforts in place, but they aren't really doing enough to have the expected outcome to preserve biodiversity protection in the long term. Then you have the other 3 outcomes, which are lightly protected, highly protected, and fully protected. And for those, you do have some conservation benefits and biodiversity protection outcomes. So those areas will move forward as candidates for 30 by 30. But there's a lot of other areas. There's a lot of lines on the map in the state of California, from fishery management areas, water quality protection areas, research reserves. There's all these other ways that we've tried to put some regulations and protections in place across the state of California. And so we are going to be using this tool in order to evaluate the biodiversity conservation effects of those other areas. And this tool really allows us to have the opportunity to recognize the long-term conservation that is taking place and that exists in those areas. The OECM tool is much simpler than the Marine Protected Area Guide in the outcome. Rather than a range of 5, it comes out as yes or no, it doesn't qualify. No, it doesn't qualify as an OECM, or yes, it does qualify as an OECM. And what that really means is when it doesn't qualify as an OECM, it doesn't mean that it isn't functioning in whatever thing that it was meant to do. It just means that that type of protection or that conservation measure isn't protecting biodiversity as a whole. When it does qualify as an OECM, then you're able to confidently say, like, yes, the management of this site and the protections that are in place on this site are expected to conserve the biodiversity that's really special, the biodiversity value that's in this place for the long term. But then, sort of as final steps for all 30 by 30 conservation areas, we really want to look at the other objectives and priorities, including access and climate. And so for the access benefits, looking at the potential access benefits of 30 by 30 conservation areas, we want to, look, is there appropriate outreach and education programming? Is there accessible and inclusive opportunities for a wide variety of experiences? Does the management contribute to environmental quality for nearby communities? And then when thinking about the potential climate benefits of 30 by 30 conservation areas, is this area perhaps eelgrass habitat that stores and sequesters carbon? Or is this area a kelp restoration area that has the potential to serve as climate refugia in the future under dynamic shifting conditions? Does the management that is there support climate adaptation and resilience and couple biological and environmental monitoring? So that's like a real quick run through on this draft framework. The document that Anne will link in the chat sort of breaks out and goes into a little bit more detail about all of these topics and the whole process. And then you can also look at the source material of this international guidance that we've been using. But we're not just taking the international guidance, we're also tailoring it to be used here in California, because there is a lot of good science and information that already exists here. So this webinar is coming as part of this really robust process, this public comment period that we've been going on from June 4th to October 2nd. And we are very welcome and open to public comment during this period. And we'll also put some links in the chat. We have a public comment form. We also have an email address that will be open until October 2nd to receive the public comment. But we've been doing a significant amount of outreach on this process and on this draft framework. We have done in-person regional workshops and tribal roundtables in Southern, Central, and Northern California. We had a virtual webinar that kicked us off, and then this is the sort of closing virtual webinar. We've presented at the National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Council meetings. We've had meetings with recreational and commercial fishing communities, coalitions of NGOs, and presented to other state and federal agency partners and groups. And in parallel to this whole process, we've been conducting tribal consultations. So the few of the sort of high level takeaways and feedback of things that we've been hearing as we've been doing these workshops all along the coast is that first one was down in Southern California. And for this, we really heard, that there was a really great attendance, fishermen, NGOs, community members, tribes, and other agency partners, and it really was a robust conversation. We heard a lot about the impacts of sewage in the Tijuana River estuary, and that protecting MPAs from the supporting enforcement of MPA regulations and protecting MPAs from the spread of invasive species was really important. We also heard to balance access with biodiversity protections, and key tribal partners at this workshop expressed a desire for tribally focused conversations. So this led us to plan dedicated tribal roundtables that we then have had in Central and Northern California and are going to go back down to Southern California to have shortly. We then went up to the Central Coast in Monterey. And the Central Coast brought together a lot of commercial and recreational fishing communities, NGOs, and other agency partners and local community members. We heard a lot about how the mudslides and closure in Big Sur have impacted access along the coast, and worries about the interaction of watershed management and coastal water quality was a big theme in the Central Coast. We also heard about the importance of tailoring international guidance for the California context and to take into consideration local science and management activities. And then finally, just last week, we got back from Arcata up in the North Coast behind the Redwood Curtain. And this workshop brought together commercial fishermen, community members, and some local NGOs. There was a lot of excitement about IMSAs, or Indigenous Marine Stewardship Areas, and the possibilities that those provide for tribal stewardship in these workshops. There was a lot of concern about offshore wind and how the industrialization of the port up there will impact the bay and the wildlife that exists now. And there was a lot of talk about the connections of fish to upland water habitat and making sure that freshwater rivers are connected to the coastal waters was really brought up repeatedly. There was a lot of really inspiring restoration success stories shared, from dune restorations in Humboldt and restoration of rivers and estuaries along the coast. So I mean, it has been a really kind of amazing, and I'll stop sharing, kind of an amazing and rewarding 120-day period that we've been on. We've had a lot of conversations all up and down the coast with a whole variety of communities that have been really robust and really inspiring. And so with that, we'll just open it up to have some time for some questions. I believe there is a Q&A function, and I'll turn it over to Anne to facilitate.
Thanks, Abby. And yeah, since this is a really nice and small, intimate group, please feel free to just unmute and let's have a discussion. If you are having some maybe audio issues, please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A, just like Abby said. But this is a small enough group, we can just have a conversation. Yeah. And Eric.
Hey, first off, thanks for the great overview, and kudos for all the amazing work you guys have done over the last 4 months and probably even longer. First off, really appreciate the opportunity to see the framework. I think it makes a lot of sense in a lot of ways, and it's great to see it based in science. I know one of the things with rolling out the MPAs in California was how much there was an attempt to be grounded in the science. And I guess one of my questions, generally speaking, is with regards to the framework. I know the MPAs were initially designed such that they were thinking about the different types of ecosystems we have off the California coast and not treating it as a monolith. How has the 30 for 30 framework kind of thought about that? And is there sub-classifications for things like kelp forest versus the eelgrass, and thinking about, the relative kind of conservation of those different key ecosystems?
That's a phenomenal question. And in fact, that's one of the things that has been brought up is, some particular ecosystems, I would say estuaries in particular would be an example that we've heard of over and over again, that people really sort of want some protections on, and kelp forest would be the other.
Yeah.
30 by 30 isn't trying to do the same spectrum of like making sure you're representative of all ecosystem habitats, because the MPA network has done that. And 30
Okay.
by 30 is expanding upon and building. And we also are trying to like look at a variety of different threats. It's not always just fishing that is an issue, and in
Definitely.
different areas you have different sort of pressures and sort of challenges. So we
Yeah.
want to maybe make the 30 by 30 process a bit more expansive and try to find
Yeah.
those areas, one, that are providing those conservation benefits right now, and then some areas that with some strength in management or with some new stewardship and a little bit of additional protections can really sort of provide benefits to a lot of those key species. But we
Yeah,
definitely
absolutely.
have heard a lot about the special areas. We've heard, those sort of regional areas, and estuaries and kelp forests came up again and again and again in
Yeah.
every conversation we've
Uh,
had.
as somebody who grew up abalone diving and has just been so saddened by the collapse of the kelp forest, it's very present. And maybe this is a good segue. I mean, I think that for me, when I think about this effort, the access is still very important. I think that there is, even amongst groups I'm a part of, a lot of the more NGO groups, a real kind of, I would say, like, focus on pure preservation, where it's like, okay, protecting is just purely removing all people who interact with the ecosystem in a harvesting way. Full restriction of all take. And I think one of the things I appreciate is like there is an access component to what you guys are doing, and I think in particular to my comment would be if we could try to balance the recreational take. Kids who get to go out with family members who then have a connection to the kelp forest, who are the ones who understand the kelp forest is suffering right now, and that the root cause is not the people who are coming and spearfishing a few fish or catching a few fish with their dad. It's these massive global factors that we all need to start solving. And I think that I guess my comment as a whole would be if we could be mindful of that access, like where are we drawing these lines? Like, are they places that are already relatively hard to get to and therefore are maybe less impactful on communities and especially the low income people who can't travel as far to go fish or do different things. And then also, like where are we drawing that line? Like a lot of the marine protected reserves, I think, are very smart and they're focused on specific species. And I think that it's easy to say like, well, we're protecting a certain area, but you're not actually doing the species you're focused on a lot of benefit because they move so much. And so I think we have to think about it from a species perspective too. Like 30 is a great number. 30 for 30 has a great ring to it. Like it's great to get public support for this. But if we don't take the holistic approach of like, what are we really trying to do from a conservation perspective? And how do we keep healthy biostocks in our ecosystem? What are those key factors that are impacting some of our key species like the kelp? And how do we actually then go target those? Like when I hear durable, like I think it's great to say we draw a line and we protected these areas, but like if we're not actively thinking about how do we manage the purple urchin blooms, then it can be durable on paper, but the biodiversity is gone still. And so I think that's where, in addition to kind of the comments I would say is like, if we can have some type of support in which if there's threats to the biodiversity, there's a willingness to allow action towards them through state entities, through a lot of the great community kind of gatherings that have happened around like the purple urchin removal, pilot projects like up in Casper Cove and up in Yo-Yo Harbor. And so, I think if we can also kind of factor in like, how do we essentially enable people to continue to engage with the ecosystem, and then for those great efforts that the communities are engaging in to target specific threats to our ecosystem, how do we support the communities to engage in those even in the areas that we're saying are durable, protected, because a lot of times there's these threats that we need to still take action against. So that's my comments. I really appreciate everything you guys have done, and I'll feel free to hand it off to other people on the call.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. And I would say that a real benefit of the framework is that we are taking that sort of threat-based approach. We're looking at the biodiversity values and the threats in the areas, and that's why we are trying to take into consideration like the purple urchin when you're looking in a kelp forest, which is going to be different than perhaps water quality threats that are exist in an estuary, which might be sort of different in another area. So we are really trying to be thoughtful in our evaluation process. Thanks, Mike. We really appreciate you being here. Yeah, so stay tuned. We are trying to get it right, taking our time to get it right. Jamie.
I just wanted to say thank you, really. This was super informative. I don't really have any follow-up questions or comments at this time,
Yeah.
but I do look forward to the tool and the framework development. I'm also just interested in how it will sort of benefit our work and our progress with our ocean plan and just figuring out like we haven't had ASBS designation since the 70s.
Right.
So yeah, you probably know all this. And so it's just very interesting. And obviously science has changed dramatically and there's so much more information available. So I'm very much at the beginning of learning about all this, but this was definitely a really great introduction. And I loved hearing the overview of how the regional workshops went and kind of who participated and the commentary and all that and the discussion. So
Yeah, I was really, I felt, I was like working so hard to develop this, we were working so hard to develop this framework to get to this public release. Then I was like, okay, well then we'll get public comment and then we'll do a draft. And then this public comment has been its own process. And it's
no
been
kidding.
it's been phenomenal. The conversations we've had, definitely some hard conversations that we've had for sure. And definitely some like really inspiring, other sort of conversations, around all of the different pulls and pressures, whether they're global changes, dynamic impacts, invasive species, or local pressures, local impacts. We have some people that want everything to be fully closed, and some people that want to make sure we balance access. And how do you make sure you sort of walk that line that you're going to end up actually having well-conserved areas that do have sort of those biodiversity outcomes you're looking for. Will also
Yeah,
maintain
absolutely.
humans exist in the environment, and that's okay. Like that's not a problem.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
unforeseen climate impacts and all that sort of stuff and
yeah,
development that yeah, I told and a 120-day comment period is wonderfully long, so that allows you a lot of opportunity to engage and receive feedback.
yeah. Originally it was 90 days, and then once we started planning out the regional workshops, we ended up doing 120. And then with the tribal consultations, we actually extended theirs, so the tribal consultation
That's
period is like
good.
160 days or something. So we're taking the time to get this right and make sure we've had a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
conversations. So then that way,
Mm-hmm.
as we move forward, people feel brought along with the process.
Mm-hmm.
We've heard a lot that the MPA process could have been improved by bringing people along a little bit better. And so we're
Mm-hmm.
really trying to make sure that through each phase of the 30 by 30 process that we are engaging and trying to be as
Yeah.
transparent as possible. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you can just do your best, and it sounds like you're trying.
Yeah.
Um, and I was gonna say, I can't imagine having to cover the whole state too. Like I guess fortunate in that it's just like a stretch of coastline. So
Right. Yeah.
kudos to you all for that.
The
But yeah,
big diverse state. It's been an amazing experience. I had one workshop at the end of it. Someone came up to me like, I came in here ready to be angry and yell. And like, this was fantastic. Like, I forget his name. My name is so and so. Nice to meet you. And I was like, nice to meet you. Like, my name's Abby.
that's
Let's
great.
keep talking. So
Wow, how
it's
ideal.
been, yeah. And it's, like I said,
That's how it has to happen.
right.
Mhm.
Yeah. We showed up ready to actually listen as much as speak. So, yeah.
Well, cool. Awesome. Well, yeah, I met Pike at OPC.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah,
I
he
think,
was engaged on the ASBS and the Central Coast process a little, and
yes,
we're keeping I'm keeping a close eye on that because it is a new designation,
right.
and we've heard a lot about water quality in areas. Both we want to make sure we can overlay some water quality protections on our existing MPAs, but
Mhm.
also in estuaries. We heard repeatedly about water quality in estuaries and how
Yeah.
new water quality protection areas in
Mhm.
estuaries would do a lot to really protect biodiversity in estuaries. And that's
Yep.
a way that you can sort of get to that biodiversity conservation and protection without changing some of the other regulatory components.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. I wish that we had immediate capacity to get going on it. Like we are slowly and surely, and we're finishing up our triennial review and about to go to the board and stuff. But I barely got to work with Pike and his manager. I forget her name.
Oh, Mike is his manager, actually, but
Oh, Mike. So it's someone else there.
yeah,
I forget her name. I'm
no
terrible with
worries.
names, but I just mostly emailed with Pike. But
Yeah.
anywho, yeah, this is very interesting. And yeah, I'm just excited to learn more. And if we have comments, we will definitely comment. So yeah, thank you. Nice
Excellent.
meeting you all.
You
Yeah.
too.
Thanks for coming out, Jamie.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I just saw it like a couple hours ago when I was on the website. I was like,
Perfect.
oh, perfect. So
I'll jump in
thanks.
on that.
Mhm.
Desmond, you haven't spoken up. Did you have any questions that you wanted to have? My question is a follow-up on Eric. Are there any plans to expand the number of annual dive permits for urchin or even making a separate permit for just for purple urchin? Well, interesting. So the 30 by 30 can only that would be something through the Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Fish and Game Commission. Like that would be something along their regulatory purview. The only way I could see that intersecting with 30 by 30 would be, for example, some of the areas we're going to be evaluating are like some kelp restoration areas up on the north coast a little bit, and if some recommendations on permits for to support some of these kelp restoration efforts and things like that would be beneficial, then I could see that being submitted to the Department of Fish and Wildlife for consideration or something like that. But the Ocean Protection Council in 30 by 30 doesn't have regulatory authority to change the number of dive permits or things like that with urchin, but we are working closely with our other agency partners.
Thank you.
Excellent.
And with that, I know that we were slated to go to 6:30, but y'all already came after work hours. So I think if there's no more questions, we can close out early, give you your 23 minutes back so you can head on to dinner. But yeah, thank you so much. Deeply appreciate you spending the time asking the questions and being part of this process.
And the
All
public
right.
comments open till October 2nd. So if you want to have any follow-up conversations, please feel free to submit. Yeah.
Perfect. All right. Have a good
Excellent.
night, everybody.
Thank you. Take care.
Take
Bye.
care.